Hello, sinister listeners. Just a quick message before we jump into the video. I've recently reached a milestone for myself of 200 subscribers, and I just wanted to take a second of your time to show some gratitude for anybody that has even clicked on one of my videos, let alone subscribed. I appreciate all the support and kind comments I've received, so thank you very much for that. In today's video, I've picked out 5 stories I've narrated that I really enjoyed and want to share for anybody that may have missed them. Secondly, I am always looking for ways to improve and openly welcome constructive criticism. So please, share in the comments any advice or opinions that you have about my content. And as ever, enjoy the sinister readings. My childhood is mostly a blur. I've never had the best memory, and my childhood was also pretty uneventful, so there isn't too much for me to remember, anyway. At least that's what I thought. And then, about a week ago, I remembered him. He was a spindly man, with limbs so thin they looked brittle, like they would break if bent the wrong way. But he could twist them in all sorts of unnatural directions. And his face, it was gaunt, with his cheeks sunk deep into his skull. But he was always smiling. Always. He had a red dot painted onto each of his sunken cheeks, a little like a clown. And then there were his eyes. Now, I remember the day I saw him. I remember every detail, which is rare for me. I was 6. And my parents were taking me to my grandmother's house. She lived fairly close, but it had been several months since I'd last seen her. It was dusk, and we were going for dinner. Like most grandmothers, mine was an excellent cook, so I was looking forward to it. We arrived, and after the usual comments about how tall I was getting, we had dinner. I don't remember what it was, just that it was delicious. I scoffed it down within a couple of minutes. The problem was that there wasn't much for a kid like me to do at Grandma's house once I'd eaten. There were plenty of books, but I couldn't read yet. So I asked her if she had any toys. She smiled at me and told me to check the closet in the guest bedroom, where she had stored all the toys from when my dad and his siblings were kids. I was curious to see what toys my dad had grown up with, so I did. Grandma apparently didn't have guests spend the night often, because the guest room was almost totally empty. Like, there wasn't even a bed. There was an old wooden chair sitting in the corner, and a blank picture frame hanging on the chipped walls. The floor was dusty, and it seemed like Grandma didn't go into that room often. The closet door was set in the far corner of the room. I walked across it and opened the door, my little hand just big enough to turn the doorknob. Inside, a collection of ancient-looking coats hung, obscuring the back of the closet. But I was more interested in the cardboard boxes sitting on the floor, each of which sported the word toys, scrawled on their sides in Sharpie. I pulled one out and opened it. Inside was a fascinating collection of old playthings, yo-yos, army men, even a couple of battered action figures. I was examining one of those when I heard movement from inside the closet, the sound of shuffling, and then a soft thump. "Who's there?" I asked. No response. "Who's there?" I demanded again. "Shh," a voice said from inside the closet. "Nobody's here." "That's not true. You're here," I said. For some reason, my stupid 6-year-old self wasn't scared, just curious and a little fascinated. "So I am," the voice said. It sounded old, but freakishly happy at the same time. Just ignore me. Why don't you come out? I asked. Because I'll scare you. I'm scary looking. If I come out, you'll scream. I promise I won't scream. Will you come out now? Maybe. A moment later, a hand poked out from behind the coats. It was so bony, it could have been skeletal if it weren't for the thin layer of skin stretched tightly over it. A second hand followed it, equally withered, and the two hands parted the coats, revealing a face. That gaunt face, with the wide smile and the painted dots on the cheeks. His eyes were closed, but I knew somehow that he could see me. And, for some reason, I wasn't afraid of him. I think I was just too young and stupid to realize how weird this whole thing was. But, true to my word, I didn't scream. He crawled out of the closet on all fours and sat down in front of me. "Hiya," he said. "You're a cute little fellow, huh?" "I guess so," I said. "Why do you look so funny?" "I don't know. I've never even seen what I look like before. But I think I'm scary looking, because whenever someone sees me, they scream. Except you. You don't scream." "I don't think you're scary," I said. "Just weird." He mused to himself. "What's your name?" I asked him. "I don't know," he said. "I don't have a name. I don't want one either." "Oh." I didn't understand why he wouldn't want a name. I was about to ask him what I was supposed to call him if he didn't have a name, but I didn't. I don't know why. "So, do you want to play with me?" he asked. "I know some fun tricks." "What tricks can you do?" I asked. He stood up and made his way across the room to the old chair. He grabbed the top with one hand and hoisted himself up off the ground, like an acrobat. And then he began to twist. His limbs were bending all the wrong ways, but I couldn't stop watching him. He twirled upside down, twisting all his joints. After about 5 minutes, he finally lowered himself down and slowly crawled back over to me. "How's that for a trick?" he asked. "That was amazing," I said, and it had been. I had never seen anything move like that before. "Glad to hear it," he said. "Say, why don't we go play in my closet? We can have even more fun in there." I looked over to the closet. It was dark and a little spooky. I wasn't sure I wanted to go inside it. I don't know about that," I said. "I think maybe I should go now." "No, don't go," he said. "Stay with me and we can have fun forever and ever. Come on." "I don't want to," I said. "I want to go." "Please." "No." And then his smile, which had remained fixed on his face the whole time, drooped a little bit. "Get in the closet," he said, though his voice was different now. It was quieter, and it carried a sharp-bladed edge. "It'll be fun, I swear." "I'm not going in the closet. You're starting to scare me." "Am I? Sorry. If you come with me, I promise I won't scare you anymore." His smile faltered even more. No, I'm not going in the closet. I'm leaving, I said. Then I stood up and took a step backwards towards the door. And what was left of his smile twisted, morphing until it was a hideous frown. His teeth were sharp, triangular points. How had I not noticed that before? Goosebumps were running along my arms and legs, and suddenly I knew that I needed to get out of there. But I didn't. I tried to move, but I found I was paralyzed. And then his eyes, which had remained closed the entire time, slid open. I screamed. They weren't eyes, they were voids, wide empty gaps that were filled only with the dark. And even as I screamed, I couldn't look away from them. They called to me somehow, and I knew that if I didn't get out, I would be lost in them forever. He rushed at me then, his spindly arms surging forward, reaching out to grab me, his frowning mouth opening so wide I could have fit my head into it with room to spare. That was what broke me out of my trance. I ran for the door as fast as my little legs would carry me, his clawed hands just centimeters away from grasping me. I flung the door open, and I could feel his claw run along my back as I bolted through it. I slammed the door shut, catching his hand between the door and the frame. I heard him screech from inside the room, and he yanked it back, letting the door shut properly. I saw this and kept running, down the hall into the kitchen, and finally to the dining room, where my parents and grandmother were still talking. I ran into my mother's lap and wrapped my arms around her, crying. They asked me what was wrong, and I told them about the thing I'd met in the guest bedroom. They didn't believe me. I remember my dad saying, "Quite an imagination, huh?" to my grandma and laughing. After we went home that night, I somehow forgot about that whole incident completely. I forgot about the guest bedroom, the strange being I'd met there, those horrific eyes, all of it. I grew up, finished school, moved out, and never thought about him. Until a week ago, I was walking home from a local coffee shop one morning, and happened to pass a skinny man with a very gaunt, pale face, and sunken cheeks and eyes. Strange, I'd thought. He looks familiar. He looks like... And then I remembered everything. That memory has haunted me constantly for the past few days. I spend every spare moment thinking about it. I wonder what would have happened to me if I'd gone into the closet with him like he'd asked. I wonder what he would have done to me if he'd caught me. And I hoped that it was just a dream. Some crazy random nightmare I had that somehow resurfaced when I saw that man on the street. That was the only remotely logical explanation I could come up with. Yesterday, curiosity got the better of me once again, and I went back to my grandmother's house. She died almost 5 years ago, but I was hoping I could talk to whoever was living there currently. I had to see that room again. I had to know. The current resident of the house was a woman in her late 20s. She looked very confused when I first knocked on her door, but I explained that my grandmother used to live in this house, and that there was something I wanted to check on. She agreed to let me look, and even offered me some snacks, which I declined. She told me that she'd converted the guest bedroom into an art studio, where she painted, but that she'd barely touched the closet at all, apart from getting rid of the boxes and jackets. When I stepped inside it, however, I was surprised to see a piece of wood lying on the floor of the otherwise empty closet. I knelt down to pick it up, and saw that it was inscribed with the phrase, "Nobody's here." A chorus of chills ran down my back at the familiar words, and I turned the wood over, wondering if there was more writing on the other side. There was. It said, "You weren't dreaming." I had 31 teeth. I know, the average is 32. When I was 17, I got hit in the face with a soccer ball, full force, knocked out my upper right incisor. Yep, just 31 teeth. Made for a good story whenever someone asked me about the gap in my mouth. Then that gap vanished about 3 weeks ago, right after a visit to the dentist's. What a time to go to the dentist, right? But I felt a hole in one of my molars, and I couldn't put off getting it looked at. My normal guy was out with the flu. New dentist was this chick, named Dr. Mills. She didn't seem so bad. I thought she was kind of pretty. But I was more focused on the pain in my tooth than the attractiveness of my new dentist. Maybe I should have paid more attention. The day after the appointment, I woke up with 32 teeth. I didn't even notice at first. I mean, why would I? I don't count my teeth. I doubt you do either. But I did notice something looked weird. I couldn't put my finger on it, of course, not until I was having a snack. Apples with caramel dipping sauce. I was on a diet, and that was my cheat for the day. I bit into the apple when I felt it. That small, hard object on my tongue that had that oh-so-familiar bloody taste to it. Immediately, I spat out everything onto the table, and among the bits of chewed apple and spit-infused caramel was a bright white tooth. Ew, I know. Disgusting. I picked up the tooth, running my tongue alongside the remaining ones in my mouth to see which one was missing. You can imagine my surprise when none of them felt like they were missing. None of them at all. I headed for the bathroom to double-check, still keeping the tooth clutched tightly in my hand. I opened my mouth, wide as I could, shined a flashlight down there to look for any gaps. Nothing. Zilch. Nada. No gaps. None at all. That's when I realized that, yes, there was in fact 32 teeth in my mouth. One more than previously, instead of one more missing. I rationalized it, of course. I mean, I was eating. Maybe it was a piece of an apple. I told myself as I chucked the tooth away in the trash. Of course, I didn't have an answer as to why I had my incisor back. But who knows? Maybe I miscounted. Maybe there was only 31 teeth, and they just readjusted themselves while Dr. Mills was handling my cavity. I know, I'm stupid. I don't need your sass. Just work with me here. By the time I went to bed that night, I was almost convinced that this was all just a massive overreaction. It was nothing. I hate being a bother, you know. When I woke up the next morning, I sat up and almost choked to death on a mouthful of teeth. 6 teeth, to be exact. The feeling of all the small hard objects flying into the back of my throat immediately had me gagging and heaving. I was lucky not to have actually thrown up. Still, all those teeth scattered across my bed, 2 of them actually landing on my floor, to be battered around by my cat, Socks. Yeah, I gathered them up the best I could. I possibly missed one, but I was still more focused on the fact that no matter how much I felt around with my tongue, I couldn't feel a single missing tooth. My gums did feel sore and oversensitive, but what the hell? What were those things if they weren't teeth? I went to the mirror again, clutching the handful of teeth. 3 molars, 1 canine, 2 of my front teeth. Yet, even as I opened my mouth to look in the mirror, there was nothing wrong. I had 33 teeth in total, each one looking fine, if not a little crooked here and there. The teeth I now kept in a small bowl in the fridge. I immediately tried calling my dentist to make an appointment because I just had no idea what these things could be but teeth. For the first time since I'd started going to that office, though, I rung out. No one picked up. No machine, nothing. I called again, of course. I called 6 times that day, and I've lost count of the times I've called since then. I work from home. I don't see people often, and I'm not close to my family. I'm what most people might call a hermit. I didn't really have anyone to turn to with all of this. And what else did I do? Of course, I googled. There's lots of reasons people can lose their teeth. Poor dental care, which, no. I brush twice a day, flossed, try to avoid too many sugary sweets, and I don't smoke or chew tobacco. You can also lose your teeth when you get older, which is also not fitting for me. I'm only 29, and other than this new teeth issue, my health was reasonably good. Also, there's the completely unexplainable fact that I wasn't missing any teeth. I just kept losing them. I had 34 mostly normal teeth in my mouth, save for a few that looked strangely sharper than your average human tooth. I was considering going to the doctor a few days in, because of course, why shouldn't I? But it's really hard to get a doctor's visit where I live right now, and because I felt physically fine, it was hard to rationalize taking a slot for someone who actually needed help. Maybe I'm an idiot, but that's just how I am. I keep making excuses. I don't like causing a fuss. Well, I'm sure you've noticed there's been a small inconsistency with my tale, as of this far. I didn't even really let it sink in until I felt my jaw start to twinge, like I'd been grinding my teeth in my sleep. I spent an hour in the bathroom counting my teeth. I was up to 42 by then. 42 teeth. People should have 32 teeth. 10 more than needed, and my jaw is having to expand to fit the new additions. Upper jaw, mostly. I am now rocking one hell of an overbite. I haven't gone outside since. Grocery delivery is a saviour in these dark times. This is past natural. I'm still spitting out more teeth, even though there's even less of a gap. They are all running into each other, so crooked and ragged. I never thought I could loathe my face more, but with my upper jaw overhanging the lower jaw by a good 3 inches now, I do hate it. My skin's all stretched, and some of my new teeth are actually poking out from between my lips, like some fucked up crocodile. If you look at me straight on, it's not nearly so bad, but my profile is just earth. I'm a monster now, losing and gaining so many teeth. My jaw aches so badly I can barely sleep. I spit out globs of red whenever I chomp down a bit too hard on something. Blood along with the white shards and splinters of what are no doubt pieces of bone. I finally snuck out last night to talk to my dentist. They hadn't answered my calls to the point I was getting paranoid, like they saw it was me and chose to ignore me. I'm thankful for the whole mask order in my state right now. It's easy to hide my mutant fucking face like that. I drove through town, heading right for my dentist's office. How strange this adventure has gotten. I get to my office and guess what? It's vacant, up for sale. It's no longer my dentist's office. It's just an empty building. I'm up to 68 teeth. My jaw hurts so bad, I can't get my personal dentist on the phone. It's like they're just gone. And as for Dr. Mills, well, I don't know where she went or what she did, but I have a sneaking suspicion she was not your average dentist. Staff Sergeant Gary Lamb hung himself from the 4th floor window of St. Ogilvy General on April 15, 2011. It took EMTs 6 minutes to break through the door he jammed shut and cut him down. By then, he'd shorn off 6 out of 8 fingernails, digging bloody furrows into his neck, and his face had swollen to the tender consistency and colour of an overripe grape. This was not to mention his tongue thrust out, and nearly severed by an involuntary clenching jaw, or the stains slicking the bottom half of his hospital gown. You didn't need a medical license to know to start unrolling the body bag. 6 minutes is eternity to an asphyxiating man. But during that time, the rapidly growing crowd in the parking lot was treated to a second horrifying spectacle. As Gary Lamb listed to and fro in the wind, a woman, a nurse perhaps, was trying and failing to pull him back into the room. Of course, the only thing she thought to pull on was the rope itself, an act that served little but to jerk and hitch the man like some kind of macabre puppet. In order to truly get Southeast Asian horror, if you're not already from there, you need to understand that we see our countries very differently from the way you do. The common perception can be found splashed across countless vlogs and perfectly curated social media pages. Pristine beaches, charming street vendors, picture-perfect weather, often shared by college graduates intent on finding themselves on a gap year. Not quite my experience. See, those of us who grew up here don't remember frolicking on the beach or going on bar crawls with our attractive friends from the hostel. We remember the heat, for one, oppressive, ever-present, and coupled with a thick, cloying humidity that sears your eyes and smothers any semblance of rational thought. We also remember old cautionary tales of horrors that follow you home because of a poorly timed, poorly phrased comment. Things that show up, not on your doorstep, but on your ceiling. Things that grab your hand as you reach for a light switch, or your ankles when you're swimming alone. Things that, as the rainforests were replaced by monoliths of glass and steel, weren't intimidated in the slightest by the advent of modernity. Maybe that's why the only time I feel safe writing about this is from an apartment in Los Angeles, several continents away. The majority of my stories come from time I spent in the military. While I've never personally seen or experienced anything during my service, the fact that we spent our time crawling through rainforest muck in the oldest parts of the country meant I met no shortage of servicemen with their share of supernatural trauma. Someone who often regaled me with stories was a technical first sergeant attached to our unit. I can't remember his name, but he and I spent many nights on guard duty at Tower 3, overlooking a lonely moonlit airfield. He was leaning over the guardrail with a cigarette, puffing acrid smoke that I was surreptitiously and futilely trying to waft away, when he told me his first story. You know Gary didn't kill himself, right? Gary was a smaller guy, maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, and it was undoubtedly a source of his chronic insecurity. Maybe that's why he was also 130 pounds of grade A dickhead. The 38-year-old staff sergeant had a permanent scowl etched into his face as he skulked around the base, and he had his own supernatural ability to conjure busy work for newly inducted servicemen. It was little surprise to find out that he was no patron saint in his personal life either. His girlfriend, Elena, was a high school sweetheart who always knew she could do better, but never quite found the courage to be single. She listened, sometimes forlornly, sometimes resentfully, as her friends described whirlwind hookups, blush-inducing trysts, and ridiculous expensive gestures lavished upon them by an unending stream of suitors. Then she watched as her group of friends eventually distilled the perfect man from the chaos of single adult life and settled down for an eternity in paradise. A paradise she'd come to realize that she was never going to have. Very little of this was true, of course. Her friends, like normal human beings, had struggles and inadequacies too. The debilitating depression that dominated most of her life simply made the grass appear greener whenever she looked. But it certainly didn't help that Gary had none of the qualities her friends gushed about. From her point of view, it looked like the man simply stopped putting in any effort the second they became official. No romantic poems, no surprise anniversary gifts, just a grey, placid coexistence in their two-bedroom apartment, a blur of waking up, going to work, coming home, and falling asleep as they bled their lives away. Perhaps it was because she felt she had so little that she sought to hold on to the scraps of her relationship with a vice grip. In the final year of their relationship, she'd become possessed with the fears of her beau's potential infidelity. Whether this manifested in non-stop texts he discreetly tried to answer during op briefings, or her showing up at the guardhouse to verify he was where he said he was, her resentment turned to obsession remarkably and disturbingly quickly. And she was right. Turns out our staff sergeant was more of a doer than a dreamer, because Elena came home one night to find him in bed with a 20-something from the club, writhing and moving with a passion that she'd never experienced once in her life. The meltdown was historic. She showed up at the camp the next day in a maelstrom of melodrama, clutching the rusted wrought iron gates as she screamed hellfire. The poor MP on duty had to pry the wiry woman off the gate, after trying unsuccessfully to cajole her off her bloodied knees, eventually swearing revenge at the staff sergeant cowering in his office. She stormed off. That same day, dressed in all red, she flung herself out of the window of their 8-story apartment. In a particularly vengeful twist, she tried to time it right as Gary was coming home from work. Fortunately for him, the sight was already a blur of sirens and police tape as he arrived. And then, the grisly, broken display was already covered by a tarp. Still, the little detail about her choice of clothing did not escape the staff sergeant. See, Elena was a Chinese woman, and the colour red holds specific significance in her culture. In fact, red is held to a sacred level in traditional Chinese culture, to the extent it is splashed everywhere at every opportunity. Just think of the last Chinese restaurant you've been to. This is no surprise, given that it's often associated with joy, vitality, and energy. All wonderful things to ascribe to a living, breathing person. When it comes to death, though, the colour we're looking for is white, representing resolution, peace, and finality. When someone kills themselves while wearing a colour, inverting this custom, it is a perversion of sanctity, somewhere on par with hanging the cross upside down. The intention behind it was unmistakable. Elena did not intend to shuffle off this mortal coil quite yet, and she certainly wasn't going to do it alone. This was a uniquely terrifying prospect to an already guilt-ridden Gary. So much so that he sought out the help of a Taoist priest the very same day. Taoist priests are renowned for their experience with appeasing or purging the restless undead, and their advice is often treated as gospel by the afflicted. The priest conferred no moral judgment upon hearing the story, but understood the magnitude of the wrath about to be visited on the hapless man. The spirit, said the medium, would roam the earth for 41 days if she returned at all. If he was able to evade her for that long, her hold over him would cease, and all would be back to normal. But how would he know she was coming? You'll hear her jumping. Jumping? The image of a dead woman hopping around the apartment was equal parts ridiculous, horrifying, and comical. Yes, she won't be able to bend over, so hide under something. A bed, for example. She can only look for you for so long before she has to move on. Well, the man had spoken. No point further questioning his advice. Gary left that temple and went home, doubt festering in his mind. 41 days. The next month was spent in a feverish haze of fear, grief, and paranoia. The first sergeant remembers Gary flinching at every noise, wide-eyed and sweaty. He retreated from tormenting the soldiers in his outfit, and never wanted to be alone. He spent more and more time on base, surrounded by his co-workers, delaying his inevitable return to that uncharacteristically empty, silent apartment. But he always had to, and while the cleanup crews did their best, not much could be done about the blood already baked into the asphalt by the unceasing summer heat. Gary always tried his best to avoid looking at the large dark stain in the parking lot right in front of the elevator, or the almost negligible splotches on the walls the cleaner missed. He seemed to notice more and more of them each time he passed by. "This one's nasty," he'd overheard an EMT say. "I've never seen a fall this bad." He was working on a report at home when he heard a terrible crash in his living room, punctuated by a heavy impact that shook the floor. Did something get knocked over? Footsteps. No, these were way too loud, too kinetic to be footfalls. He rose to check, but growing suspicion stayed his feet. He thought he heard several secondary impacts, as whatever was falling crumpled to the ground. Falling. He began to shake as his subconscious finally began connecting the dots, disparate clues coalescing into one horrifying certainty. You'll hear her jumping. Stilling his breath as much as possible, he got on the ground, shimmied beneath the bed, and squeezed his eyes shut. The bed wasn't raised very far off the ground, and he found himself face up, with no room to move, except to turn his head left and right. The bedroom door flew open. Tears flowed freely as he balled his fists and clenched his teeth, fighting to control his rapidly hyperventilating breath. This one landed right beside his ear, up close. He could hear it all, bones splintering, flesh tearing away from the wet impact. And then all was quiet. Nobody knows how long he stayed there, frozen in place, eyes shut, barely daring to breathe. Terrified as he was, even the adrenaline roaring in his ears wasn't designed to last forever. His pulse eventually slowed, and hope cruelly began to rear its head in his mind. Had she moved on? Was it over? Fearing the worst, he chanced a glance to his left. When the eyes perceive something the brain refuses to acknowledge, time seems to bend. Everyone's gone through it to some degree. A breakup text, a positive diagnosis. a gun barrel in the face. The mind is seized by conflicting impulses, one half screaming for action as reptilian instincts of self-preservation kick in, the second trying its utmost to deny a reality that has already established a firm, non-negotiable grip. Time slows during this neurological tug-of-war, casting every terrifying detail in stark relief. The first sergeant found him under the bed during a wellness check when he failed to report the next morning. Gary lunged out from his hiding spot, clutching him like a lifesaver and blubbering out his story in between hitching, gut-wrenching screams. The horror he beheld was enough to have him hospitalized for months. In that time, he attempted suicide thrice. The fourth, well, we already know about that one. You see, the priest had been right, but only in principle. Whatever was staring at him under the bed, through cloudy, lifeless eyes, could never have bent over to leer at him. It was broken in all the wrong places. If she were jumping around the apartment in that absurd pogo-like fashion he'd imagined, the staff sergeant would have been entirely, irrefutably safe. The rookie priest just hadn't considered one thing. She landed on her head. Wait, you said he didn't kill himself. I mean, he tried 3 times, barricaded his door and everything. Maybe he just finally figured it out. I shifted uncomfortably against the guardhouse. The first sergeant turned to fix me with a steely look. You can't barricade doors in a mental ward. You think he would have been the first to try that, and the last couple times I spoke to him, he didn't seem suicidal at all. He just really, really didn't want to be alone. I felt the rational part of my brain clicking on overdrive as I fought to deny what the first sergeant was driving at. You're telling me a ghost simultaneously held the door shut, tied a noose around it, and flung his arse out of the window? What about the nurse who tried to save him? I'm saying there's a lot that doesn't add up. The only person that saw that nurse up close was Dr. Chakrabarti, working the next ward over. Not only did the doctor not recognize this woman, he said she was wearing the widest grin he'd ever seen. The sergeant paused, taking a long drag of his cigarette. And he sure as hell doesn't know any nurse that wears red. Dames Point is a little town on the east coast that at one time was considered picturesque. Despite this, not many people make it a habit to visit, due to the unwelcoming nature of the few that reside there. Maybe it's the salty air, the golden beaches, or the wooded hills that roll on forever that keep the townies around. Or maybe it's a darker secret, not spoken of in public, that haunts this town's past and keeps the residents as prisoners. It has been whispered in some circles that Dames Point, once a thriving fishing and port town, fell on hard times around the turn of the last century. Whatever caused this is unknown and only speculated. Some talk about a pirate's curse, others mention voodoo spells and witchcraft. Some even go as far as to say it was an ancient race of dark mermaids. That the mayor's son had once been lured in by one of these creatures and made a vow he never kept. Since then, the town has known nothing but despair. Most sensible people overlook these tales and assume it's a town that had run its course with bigger cities such as Charleston, Baltimore, and Boston taking over its business. Whatever the case, it didn't matter much to me. I had been assigned by the state auditor to go there and assessed the decline of the town. It had been over 100 years since anyone had taken an interest in this place, but due to the new revitalization programs enacted by the governor, someone had to do it. Upon entering the town, the first thing that caught my attention was the rundown appearance of the place. There were holes in the steep, pitched, colonial roofs of the houses. An old industrial complex from which steam poured out of greasy canneries, leaving a foul smell in the air. To be fair, everything outside of town was postcard perfect, but once inside, it was like a trip to another dimension, where building design froze in the early 1900s, but entropy continued to march on. There was a road going north to south that ran straight through the sleepy village, once part of the old highway system that fell out of use once interstates were built. Yet one more reason why this place was in its severe state of decline. From this old highway, other roads spider-webbed off and through the city. At one point, this place had about 50,000 people living in her. Now, it was down to 3,000 at most. My first stop was at the local hotel, where I was going to drop my bags before making my way to the one corporation still busy here. J.K. & Sons Fish Cannery had been operating since the late 1800s, but while still active, they didn't do much business and packaged foods under other corporations' names. The hotel was dilapidated like the rest of the town. The clerk's mahogany desk was as greasy as the air. A thin film of filth coated the reddish-brown wood, making it sticky and almost black. Behind the desk sat a man with thinning hair and a pale complexion. His eyes were slightly bulging, and his lips so swollen they appeared that they could burst at any moment. He wore a tank top that had been stained brown by sweat and barely covered his portly body. Without making any small talk, I introduced myself and asked for my room key. Despite his ghastly appearance, he was soft-spoken, if not somewhat feeble-minded. His speech slurred a bit, not from intoxication, but from being slow of thought. Eventually, I got to my room and settled in. The bed was clean and the accommodation adequate. Whatever care was put into the rooms was not put into the rest of the hotel. After lunch, which fortunately I had brought with me, I walked the short way to the office building. Some of the houses lacked doors, which at first I thought meant they were abandoned, until I saw a family in one eating a meagre meal. In the dim kerosene lamplight that filled the place, I could make out that they were dirty, dishevelled, and unkempt. The kids had filthy faces, and were dressed in tatters. Poverty hung on the place like a limp dish rag. There was a gas station and a small convenience store that seemed to be the only shopping place in town. I assumed most people drove the 30 minutes to the next town over for any major purchases, but the lack of cars in town would have said otherwise. Most of the buildings were vacant, and at one time probably fine stores with quality merchandise. On one window, I could still see the old stenciling for a toy store. Another had a marquee for a clothing shop. The insides were now dusty, and had cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. At the wharf, the smell of dead fish was overpowering. Flies buzzed all around, and rats scurried away from my approach. The office of the owner, who was J.K.'s son, his name was Artemis, was in the back of the building. There were maybe 100 employees on shift at the time, which made me wonder what the other ones who lived in town did. I won't bore you with the business talk we had about the proposed plans and loans from the governor to update antiquated equipment in the cannery, how the governor wanted to make her state competitive across all fronts and ensure small businesses had a chance to compete with larger corporations with small business subsidies and low interest loans. I will tell you that Artemis only met my speech with contempt and a look of loathing in his piercing grey eyes. With hands tucked into his spotless white suit, He made clear, in no small terms, that me and my help, nor the government, were wanted in his town, as he called it. Based on the outside appearance of the building, I would have assumed he was going to welcome me with open arms. The inside of his office was another story, however. It was immaculate in its appearance. The floor spotless. His desktop sparkled with the reflection of the sun outside his window. There was even ivory trim inlaid into the teakwood desk. Not to mention the stench from outside somehow didn't make it into the room. There was a complete disconnect inside this place from the outside surrounding it. I was scheduled to meet with him for 2 days, but the conversation was over in a matter of hours. By the time I left, it was only a little after 3. There was plenty of time for me to drive back that day, and not have to spend the night in a tiny run-down town whose stench was sticking to my skin by this point. I got back to the hotel and checked out. Went to my car to find that it wouldn't start. Soon realised that the battery was gone. Not dead or unserviceable, but completely vanished. Tried to use my cell phone, but had no coverage, so I went in to use the phone at the desk. The man at the desk told me the phone was dead, and had been for some time. But he did offer to get a mechanic to look at the car. It took over an hour for them to get back, and the mechanic told me that he had a shipment of batteries coming in the next day, that if I waited at the hotel that night, he would get me going first thing in the morning. That didn't sit well with me, but I left my bags in the lobby and told the clerk that I would be back for them in a bit. During that time, I went for a walk around town, desperately trying to get some kind of call service. Up and down the main road I walked. Then, when that failed, I went throughout the small town, hoping beyond hope that I would get a signal so that I could get out as soon as possible. The whole time I was walking, I could feel eyes staring at me from inside each abandoned building. It was as if the whole town was watching me. On top of one of the many hills, I found a house unlike the rest. It was in good repair, with an iron fence around the lot. The yard was green, and on the front porch there were large wooden pillars supporting a balcony. It had the appearance of an old plantation home from further down south. It gave me chills to see such a luxury in the otherwise squalor of the town. I could almost hear the faint echo of screams and whips around me. Something wasn't adding up about this town, or Artemis, who I supposed this house belonged to. It was like there was some kind of spell on the people below, but up on this hill, one could rise above it. Halfway down the hill, and a quiet whistle caught my attention. A hand waved to me from the woods, calling me to someone behind a tree. Suspicious and hesitant, I carefully made my way towards the whistle, my hands half raised and ready in case I was attacked. Mister, you gotta get out of here, a man's voice said to me from behind the tree. They don't like outsiders here in town. Get out before it gets dark. What do you mean, they? I asked. The bosses. If you don't leave before dark, they'll trap you here, like everyone else, the voice said. Who are these bosses? I work for the governor. This whole town is suspicious. If you tell me what's going on, I can get help. There's no help here. Any man can give. It's best you just go. Well, my car is dead, and there's no phone service. How am I supposed to get out? Walk if you have to, but not out on the main road. They watch that at night. Go through the path behind the big house. If you see the torches, it's too late. Go, and fast. I can't turn a blind eye to this. If people are being held here against their will, they have to do something about it. There's nothing on this earth that can change what has happened here. And to tell the truth, all of us deserve it. But if you're here after dark, the bosses will think you're one of us. They don't discriminate. Let me get this straight. The people here have bosses that only show up at night. They keep them here, and if I'm caught here at night, I'll be forced to stay as well. This sounds crazy, but if it's true, it would have to go to the courts. It's outrageously illegal. I'm afraid these people were judged and convicted a long time ago, the voice told me. I still hadn't seen who this voice belonged to, since he stayed on the far side of the tree. You're gonna have to tell me what's going on, or I won't go, and I'll take my chances here to see firsthand these things you're talking about. All right. But you might not like or believe what I tell you. The voice then went on to tell me how Dames Point had once been a hub for the Atlantic slave trade. The mayor had even allowed it, after it had been outlawed because of his greed. By night, ships would come in and unload their cargo, selling slaves by the moonlight. Then, one day, they smuggled in a voodoo priestess from Jamaica. She was resistant and beaten worse than anyone had ever been. In her dying breath, she laid a curse on the whole town, declaring it to forever be bound in blood to its wretched ways. The townspeople laughed and spat on her while she passed from her wounds. But that very night, the bosses, who were apparitions of greed, tyranny, violence, and oppression, came out of the ocean with their torches in their hands and laid the whip to everyone in the town. Anyone caught in the town would forever be guilty, and unable to escape the punishment of these vices, paid back tenfold. What does Artemis have to do with all of this? I asked. I had my suspicion that he was somehow the ringleader. That man is Satan incarnate, and that's all I'll say about Artemis, the voice replied. I could hardly believe my ears until the man stepped out from behind the tree. He showed me his wounds, and where his back had been scourged open from the whippings, always festering and never healing. The sun was starting to get low in the sky, so I left my bag at the hotel, abandoned my car, and made my way up the trail behind the house on the hill. It wasn't soon after I hit the peak of the hill that the last rays of the sun were extinguished. I stopped for a moment, taken by a morbid curiosity to see if what the man had told me was true. Sure enough, as soon as the light left the sky, a parade of torches, one at first and then many, came marching out of the sea. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse through a window on the house that sat on the hill. A devilish orange glow erupted. As I turned to leave, so as to not be caught up in what would happen next, I could hear the whips and the screams coming from below. A tinge of guilt crept through my body for not being able to do something to save them from the evil they themselves had created. But furthermore, what still haunts me is, I know that there really is a hell on earth, and if you're not careful, you could end up there. Most people have a relic from their childhood that they keep around. Maybe it's a beloved toy they can't bring themselves to throw away, or a happy memory to keep in their wallet. Maybe it's a scar from some silly mistake, or worse, the wounds that can't be seen, the ones that hide on the inside. Something that has shaped who they are, quirks, passions, fears. We all have something we keep. Mine is a dark wooden box. I hate that fucking box. I hide it away, stuffed at the back of my bottom drawer, wrapped in a tea towel so I don't even have to look at it. My husband doesn't know why I refuse to have that walnut laminate flooring in our dining room. It's because it reminds me of that bloody box. Well, today he found it, and I don't know what to do. I freaked out. There are a million ways I could have handled it better, but I panicked. I saw the wood, saw him reach for the clasp. I actually scratched his arm pretty badly without meaning to. I've managed to convince him to just drop it for now, but I know he thinks I'm crazy. And, worst of all, I know the moment I leave this house, he's going to try and find it and look inside. And then what? I suppose I should explain. Growing up in the 80s wasn't easy, not for my brother, and for me at least. To this day, I still don't know for sure what my mother did for work, though I have my suspicions. What I do know is that we were as close to poverty as it's possible to get without moving outdoors, or out of mainland Europe. Most people dismiss Liverpool because of the funny accent, but it has darker shadows than anywhere I've ever been in my life. There's a story about a man who travelled the world on his bicycle, visited every country, then returned to England, only to get his bike nicked in Liverpool. That says it all. Just like any city, it's got nice parts. Then there's the underbelly, where the scroats live. Well, we were the scroats. Me, my big brother Jacob, and our occasional mother. Looking back, it was a lot like having a cat. She'd come when she wanted something, leave whenever she liked, and occasionally bring us gifts we didn't appreciate or want. Cats bring dead birds. My mother brought gold watches, cigarettes, and pot noodles. I was 7 years old, and I loved her so very, very much. With no father and an infrequent mother, Jacob had no choice but to become the man of the house. I say house, it was a one-room bedsit with a mattress on the floor. Jacob was 12 years old, and whilst he always seemed like a giant to me, he was too young and scrawny to mix with the bigger kids on the block, especially with a younger sister in tow. So, we stayed in the flat most of the time, garnering annoyance and sympathy in equal measures. Our flat was 4 stories high, and filled with all sorts of wonderful characters you would cross the street to avoid. There were bad ones, like the old man we only ever knew as Mr. Creepy, and there were good ones, like Mrs. Cooper, who would give us food whenever we passed her door. But my absolute favourite was a rather large Jamaican lady who called herself Mama Jane. She had an accent that was thick as treacle and owned the shop at the bottom of our flat. Mama Jane's shop was the kind of bric-a-brac weirdo museum you just don't see on the high street anymore, and since she didn't mind our company, it became our adoptive home. Whilst the shop sold any type of item you can imagine, Mama Jane had a particular fascination with dolls. If it was miniature and had anything vaguely resembling a face, Mama Jane would buy it, display it in her shop window, and pronounce it was not for sale. Even those racist little golly dollies that people used to collect. Sometimes people told her she shouldn't put them in her shop window, but she just shrugged and said it was her shop, and if they didn't like it, they could stick it where the sun didn't shine. Nothing with a smile like that can be hateful, she'd say. If we helped around the shop, we could play with any toy we liked, but only one. I didn't really know how much we helped, but Mama Jane would let us play with something from her shop almost every day. There was an unspoken code about it, something of a ritual. We wouldn't pick anything that looked like it would break, and Mama Jane would let us stay in the shop for as long as we liked, providing we didn't bother customers. This was an easy rule to follow, as there usually weren't any. People did bring things to Mama Jane, though, and one particular day, a tall Jamaican man with dreadlocks dangling over his shoulder brought a walnut-coloured box into the shop. I know he was Jamaican because whenever someone from Jamaica came into the shop, Mama Jane's accent would intensify to the point where a 7-year-old Liverpudlian girl could no longer gain any meaning. I was playing with my favourite vintage doll, a horrific sun-bleached thing that I called Tabitha, and Jacob was playing with his train, driving it along the stained carpet enthusiastically. "Watch the shop, children," Mama Jane called behind her as she and the man disappeared into the back to talk business. After a while, they came back, talking quietly amongst themselves. I could tell Mama Jane was excited. The man's box was gone, and as he left the shop, Mama Jane locked the door, turned the open sign to closed, then burst into gleeful laughter, stomping her feet and swaying from side to side. "What you get today, Mama?" Jacob asked. "Oh, child," she said, clasping her hands together. "Come, see." We both placed our toys back carefully on their respective shelves. Abandoning a toy meant you did not want it, Mama always claimed, then followed her into the back of the shop. This in itself was something of a rare treat, and her excitement was infectious, even without me or Jacob knowing what we were exactly excited about. Inside her back office, on her desk, was the dark wooden box. Now I could see it properly, about the size of 2 big books stacked on top of each other. It was locked tight with 2 brass clasps. Mama Jane brushed her hand along the walnut lid and looked down at us. "Do you believe in magic, children?" she asked in a whisper. Her wide eyes made me nod without even really thinking about the question. "Magic's for kids," said Jacob defiantly. That what you think, is it?" said Mama, her voice purring. She snapped one clasp open, then the other. Pausing with her hand on the lid, she met our eyes and drank us in. I realized I was leaning so far forwards, I was close to toppling on my face. Whatever Mama was thinking, she decided to proceed and lifted the lid. Jacob stood on tiptoes to peer inside, but I was too short to see. All I could see was the green velvet interior of the lid, and Mama Jane carefully lowering her hands inside the box. She was so tender lifting the contents out. At first I thought it was a newborn baby. As I got my first good look, I found myself disappointed. It was just a plain doll, made out of a Hessian sack. It had black button eyes and a stitched-on smile made from black thread. It didn't have hands, hair, or any clothing. I couldn't see why Mama Jane was so excited about this boring doll until she placed it down. Rather than crumpling to the floor like every doll I'd ever seen, it remained upright as Mama Jane took her hands away. Even though it was bent forwards, with its arms almost touching the carpet, it didn't fall over. Even my childlike grasp of physics told me this was strange, though I didn't understand why. Then it began to move. It lifted its Hessian arms and straightened, standing completely upright. When it clapped its little stumps together, Mama Jane started laughing in her great big booming way that meant something was truly delighting her. We'd seen puppets before, but they had strings. It was a game that we chose to play along with. This was something else. This was real magic. I was so enraptured with the moving doll, it took me a moment to notice that Mama Jane was clapping in time with it. When each of its Hessian hands joined together, a clap would sound from above me. At first I thought she was copying it, but then I glanced from one to the other. I realized it was the other way round. The doll was copying Mama Jane's movements perfectly, as though they were twins. "What is it?" I asked. "How does it work?" asked Jacob. Mama Jane just laughed and began walking around the room. The little doll did the same. As they moved, it almost looked like a synchronized dance routine. She jumped into the air, and the doll leapt off the floor in a mirror image, landing back on its feet with ease. We both applauded in sheer childish glee. "I want to go," said Jacob. Mama Jane leant over to him and wagged a finger. On the floor, the doll wiggled a stumpy limb. "It's not so easy, child," said Mama. Jacob scrunched up his face, eyes locked on the doll. Mama Jane ruffled his hair, and the doll reached into empty space to do the same. "What's its name?" I asked. "He don't have a name yet." It seemed a little sad to me. I waved at him and said, "Hello." Mama Jane waved into empty space, and the doll copied her. Even though I knew Mama was doing it, I was impressed how much it looked like the doll was truly waving at me. Its button eyes were staring right at me. Mama seemed less impressed though, and snatched up the doll, placed him inside the box and clasped it shut so quickly I almost didn't believe it had happened. She rested over the box for quite a long time, long enough for me and Jacob to share a worried look. When Mama Jane turned around, she had stopped smiling, and her cheeks had gone pale. "I don't want you to tell nobody about this, you hear?" We both nodded frantically. It wasn't like we had anyone to tell besides each other. "Run along now," she said, scuttling us out of the back of the office. We said goodbye, but Mama Jane didn't say it back. The door to the office slammed shut behind us and was promptly locked. Me and Jacob went upstairs, excitedly babbling to each other about the doll and what we could make it do when we had our turns. I began thinking of names for the doll, but Jacob didn't like any of my suggestions. Our real mother didn't come home that night, and I woke up a few times to Jacob accidentally jabbing me with a knee or elbow as he tossed and turned in the night. I remember opening my eyes to see him barely visible in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling. "You okay?" I asked. "I don't get how it works." "Mama said it was magic," I replied, closing my eyes again. "Magic's not real," Jacob said in a grumpy voice, throwing himself into his side. That night I dreamed of dancing dolls, vintage Victorian ones, with rippling dresses. Barbies, all box fresh and pretty. Golly dollies and Cabbage Patch Kids, all holding hands in a huge circle and twirling. At the centre of it all, the Hessian doll, with his button eyes and stitched-on smile. I woke to Jacob nudging me. He already had his shoes on and was shoving mine in my face. "Come on," he said, leaping up and holding the door open for me. Still rubbing sleep from my eyes, I started walking towards Mrs. Cooper's flat, but Jacob pulled my arm and whirled me towards the staircase. "But I'm hungry," I moaned, grabbing my belly dramatically. "We'll get food later," said Jacob. It was difficult to keep up with him that morning. He leapt downstairs and ran across the halls, stopping and waiting for me whenever he went too far. He grinned like a Cheshire cat when the back door to Mama Jane's shop opened, and we crept inside. Mama was polishing shelves and looked up as we entered. "Good Lord, children. You're out here early today. I'm thinking you'd be wanting something." She chuckled to herself and threw her duster over her shoulder. "Have you got chores for us, Mama?" Jacob asked. I watched him closely. We did chores, sure, but we never asked for them, especially not Jacob. He was up to something. It didn't pass Mama Jane's notice either. She narrowed her eyes at us. "Is that what you both want, is it?" I looked down at the floor, instinctually trying to look small and pitiful. "I want food," I said in a small voice. She let out a disapproving That was the sound she often made when we discussed our mother, either directly or indirectly. She held out her hand and led me through the back. As we walked away, she called to Jacob over her shoulder. "You can clean them windows then, boy. Keep going till you see your face in them." Mama Jane didn't make us food very often, but I was hoping for a bit of lamb patty she'd shared with us once. No such luck on that day, though. I just got jam on toast. She picked me up and let me sit on the counter of her makeshift kitchen, humming to herself as she buttered the toast and spread the jam. I told her of the names I'd thought for the doll, and she said they were pretty. After I'd eaten the last crust, Mama Jane never let us eat outside of the kitchen. We walked back into the shop. I was ready to do some chores now, if it meant getting to play with the doll again. But as we walked around the shelves, the shop was empty. Where my brother should have been cleaning windows, there were just dingy net curtains and dolls perched on wooden chairs. Mama Jane walked outside, bell jangling as she looked left and right. But Jacob wasn't there. She came back inside, eyes darting around the shop. I tried looking too, but I couldn't see Jacob anywhere. My eyes fell on the door to the back office, which Mama Jane always kept locked. Mama Jane seemed to have the same idea and walked over to it, testing the handle. It opened. She pushed the door open, and in the center of the room was Jacob, scrambling on his knees. The walnut box was wide open, green velvet insides on show. Jacob was crying and kept turning so we couldn't see what he had in his hands. "I just wanted to see how it worked," he said through tears. He turned to us, and stuffing spilled out of his hands onto the floor. There was a small gash on the side of the doll, and Jacob's pocket knife lay on the floor, still open. I began crying too. Mama Jane moved over to Jacob, but as she moved, the doll stayed still. I charged towards Jacob and shoved him as hard as I could. "You killed him!" I cried, eyes stinging so badly I couldn't even see my brother. "He didn't even have a name yet." Mama Jane said nothing, and as I wiped away my tears on a sleeve, I saw Jacob only had eyes for her, fearfully waiting for her reaction. We'd never seen Mama Jane angry. Not really. She was a woman who gave a hint of what her anger could feel like, and that made you never want to prod further. In that moment, I became afraid too. Afraid that we'd lose our second home. Afraid that we'd lose Mama. She plucked the doll from Jacob's hands and carried it over to her desk without saying a word. Mama calmly scooped up the stuffing pieces on the floor. The only sound was Jacob's choked sobs and my sniffles. Once every piece was on the table, she gazed down at the doll, shook her head, and muttered something under her breath. Then she buried her head in her hands and said, "This is a very bad thing you've done, Jacob." It was the first time I'd ever heard her call any of us by name. We were always child or children. Mama Jane began to cry, and to our complete surprise, she turned and wrapped both of us into a tight hug. "I'm really sorry, Mama," whispered Jacob. "Can you fix him?" Still clutching one another, we walked over to the desk and stared at the unmoving doll. He looked so sad now, half deflated with his insides missing. "I'm not sure I should, Jacob," said Mama Jane, clamping hold of my arm and squeezing tight. "Some things in this world aren't to be toyed with." Nodding to herself, Mama released us both and began to pull out the rest of the doll's stuffing. Once there was nothing left, she placed the doll back inside its walnut box and closed the lid. She placed it high on a bookshelf that even she could barely reach, and gathered up the stuffing into a pile. "I'm sorry, Mama," said Jacob again. "Run along now, children," she said without looking at us. We skulked out without another word, walked back up into the flats, and spent the rest of the day sulking in our bedsit. Our own mother came home that night, quite late, collapsed without a word at the side of us onto the mattress. I waited until she fell asleep, then cuddled her arm. Mornings with Mother were terribly quiet. We would wait to see what mood she was in, creeping around and whispering. At the time, it just seemed like a game to me. It seems considerate not to wake her. I realize now, Jacob was doing it to extend the time we had where she wasn't awake. The sirens ruined that. Police, ambulance, more police. Something bad had happened, and our mother was convinced we should stay inside until they went away. Me and Jacob peeked through the curtains, watching the street below, but we couldn't see anything other than the tops of cars and people gawking at our building. Eventually, anyone in uniform left, and our flat returned to normality. We could leave, and our mother was first to do so. Me and Jacob visited some neighbours, but kept inside the halls, too afraid to go back to Mama Jane's so soon. Mrs. Cooper made us peanut butter sandwiches and taught us how to tell the time, or tried to, at least. We asked her what had happened with the police, but she said we didn't need to worry about that. The next day, when we tried to visit Mama Jane, her door was locked and covered with tape. It said police on it, but neither me or Jacob really knew what that meant. We went outside and tried to go to the front door, but that was locked too. It would be 2 more days before we found out Mama Jane was dead. Murdered, our mother said. Our neighbours had spared us all the gruesome details, but we pestered our mother until she spilled out every last drop. Someone had stabbed her to death. They tried to make it look like a suicide, but it was too obvious. They'd cut her open, then put the knife in her hands. I cried myself to sleep that night. Jacob refused to lie down and curled up in a ball near the corner of the room. Our mother got sick of our whining and left in the middle of the night. She said Mama Jane was a bitch anyway, and probably got what was coming to her. I didn't believe that. I think that was the night any love for my mother began to unravel for me. She said a lot of nasty things that night, things that I don't truly remember, but I remember how it made me feel. Days passed, and we began to hear more details. Mama Jane hadn't just been stabbed, she'd been disemboweled. Her intestines had been pulled out all over the floor, and parts of them were missing. When we heard that, we crept downstairs the same night, and Jacob showed me a trick with a pocket knife, a debit card, and a door lock. I'd never been inside Mama Jane's shop in the darkness, and everything about it took on a dark tilt without her in the world. I clutched hold of Jacob as we made our way towards the office, where Jacob repeated his trick. Inside the room, I noticed the only thing different about the shop, other than no light and no Mama. The carpet. A huge rectangle of carpet had been cut up and removed, just beneath the desk. At the time, it had baffled us. Now I know that was where she had died. Of course, there was only one thing that we wanted to check. One suspicion we couldn't let lie. Together we moved the chair and the desk, and Jacob climbed on top to reach the walnut box. As soon as he placed it down and ran his thumbs along the clasps, I wanted to leave. I wanted to forget the whole thing. I missed Mama, and I couldn't bring her back. I was just a little girl, but I knew nothing good could come of this. But I couldn't stop Jacob. He snapped open the clasps and threw back the lid. The doll was still inside, but it was whole again. The gash Jacob had made had been stitched back together. Its stuffing was back, apparently. Maybe Mama fixed it, I hissed, creeping towards the door. Jacob clearly wasn't happy with that explanation, and he reached into the box to pick up the doll. As he did, it squelched. I had no comparison as a child. but it was the sound that raw chicken fillets make if you squeeze them together. Disgusted, Jacob finched and dropped the doll onto the floor. It twisted in the air and landed on its feet with a squishy noise. I don't know how long we stared at that doll for. Neither of us dared move. When Jacob finally moved to pick up the doll took a step forwards too. This made Jacob finch back, yank his hands away, and the doll copied him on the floor, stumbling back, then raising its little stumps defensively. "Pick it up!" Jacob screamed. I tried to calm him down. We were supposed to be keeping quiet, but my brother was being hysterical. "Pick it up! Pick it up!" he screamed again, his voice high-pitched and terrifying. I did it. I reached down and picked up the little doll. It was moist and soft in my hands. It made that same sickening squelch as I placed it down in its box. Jacob paced around the room, head in his hands, babbling to himself so fast and so quietly I couldn't even hear what he was saying. I couldn't take my eyes off the walnut box. It wobbled around as the doll walked in its edges, trying to imitate Jacob's movements in what tiny space it had. I didn't really understand why Jacob was so scared. I was glad the doll was back to normal and alive again. We might have lost Mama, but at least we had the doll. "Did Mama fix you?" I asked him. The doll stopped pacing, looked up at me and nodded. To my side, Jacob let out a sheer animal yelp of fear. He toppled onto the floor, kicking himself away to curl up against a wall. "It made me move," he cried, lips quivering, tears streaming down his face. "It made me move." I looked inside the box. The doll was imitating Jacob perfectly, pushing backwards and shaking with fear. I didn't truly understand. I was just a little girl, but my brother's fear was enough to make me close the box and encase the doll in darkness. Without knowing what to say, I did the only thing I knew how, and curled up next to my brother, hugging his arm as he cried like a baby. He was always the strong one, always the protector who knew what to do next. God knows I didn't. We must have sat together like that for a long time. Eventually, he composed himself and said, "We need to hide it somewhere." He stood up, sliding free from my grip, and nodded to himself. "We need to hide it somewhere. Nobody will ever find it." And he did. Jacob made me stay upstairs in the flat whilst he went out. He refused to tell me where he'd go, but he was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, it had just started raining, and his clothes were wet. He didn't say anything as I helped him undress, but when he lay on the mattress, I wrapped the duvet around him, as he had done to me so many times. He met my eyes then and smiled. "I love you," he whispered. We fell asleep hugging, and when I woke up, for the first time in my life, I was alone. No mother, no Jacob. The front door was still ajar. Our singular room had felt small all my life, but in that moment, it felt impossibly large and daunting. I searched the flat for him. I walked the halls. I cried. Mrs. Cooper eventually rang the police, and I stayed at hers until they arrived. Of course, it didn't take long for a picture to be painted. Missing boy, abandoned girl. I never saw my mother again. Turned out I had an auntie, though. I stopped with them that night, and I never said a word. Especially not when I found out Jacob was dead. Years later, I would learn police found him floating face down in the canal. It got recorded as an accidental death. Just another kid who ran away from home, slipped into the waters, and couldn't climb back out. But I knew the truth. Jacob wouldn't run away, not without me. It had been the doll. Jacob threw him away, so he had thrown Jacob away. Mama Jane had pulled out his insides, so the doll had done the same to her. My auntie had a huge flat, and I got to sleep in the bed while she stayed on the sofa. I'd never slept in an actual bed before, but that night I didn't really appreciate the experience. My body clearly did though, as I fell asleep not long after my auntie wished me good night and turned the light off. I dreamed that night, a vivid dream that I was walking down a cold, wet street. The glare from the lamppost above me made me want to blink and squint, but for some reason I couldn't. And they were impossibly large, towering over me. One hand was behind me, dragging something. For a long time I just kept walking, but some numb part of my mind wondered what I was dragging. I turned and met Jacob, staring at me with wide, glassy eyes. He was sat upright, and I was dragging his coffin. It was filled with dark, dirty water up to his shoulders. The sight of it was enough to shock me out of my dream. I wanted to sit upright, throw my covers off, and find my newly discovered auntie. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. Locked in position, all I could do was stare at the ceiling and wonder why it felt like there was ground beneath my feet, even though I was laying down in bed. Then my arm moved. It's a difficult sensation to describe. It was like cramp or a spasm, without the pain. My muscles were moving, but I wasn't in control. I couldn't even try to wrestle with it. I couldn't strain or fight it. I could only watch as my right arm lifted, bending at the elbow. My hand formed a fist, and as though I were knocking on a door, my hand knocked the air. There was the faintest little tap-tap, perfectly in time with my gesture. Then my paralysis melted away, and I was back in control. After flexing my fingers and wiggling my toes, I threw back the covers and looked around the room. Something had made a noise, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I looked under the bed and inside the drawers, opened the cupboard and climbed the table to search the shelves. As I walked back to the bed, something took hold of me and my entire body went rigid. Again, my hand made a fist and raised to knock on nothing at all. I let out a little whimper, not wanting to scream and wake up my auntie. As my knuckles rapped on the air, once again I heard the faint tap-tap. This time, I realized where it was coming from. The window. I was released again, and almost fell to the floor as my muscles struggled to adjust to my sudden regained control. The curtains were drawn over the window, and I made my way over, slowly peeling them back. It was so dark outside, it was hard to make anything out, but the dim orange haze from the streetlights at least let me see there was something on the exterior windowsill. A walnut box, open, and staring through the window at me were two glinting black button eyes. My brother's killer, Mama Jane's killer. The doll had come back for me. How had it got here? Had it been controlling me while I slept, walking down the dark streets of Liverpool, dragging its wretched box and making me dream of coffins? We watched each other for a long time. It didn't take control of me. That made me think it was waiting to see what I did. Jacob and Mama Jane had been retaliation for the way they treated it. As quietly as I could, I opened the window and carefully pulled the box through, doll still standing inside. My hands were shaking so much that any normal doll would have shaken too. But even though the walnut box trembled in my hands, the doll stood completely still. I closed the window. The doll was drenched from rainwater, and with the window shut, I could almost feel the stench rising upward. I lowered until our eyes were inches apart, then kissed him softly on the top of his Hessian head. It was wet on my lips, and the smell was unbearable. "Good night, Mr. Buttons," I whispered. Picking the doll up, I laid him tenderly down in his box, trying my best to ignore the squelch, and found a little dust cloth to wrap around him like a bedsheet. Closing the box, I hid it under a few papers in one of my auntie's drawers. I went to bed, but didn't sleep. By the end of the next day, when nothing bad had happened, I repeated my actions of the previous night. Open the box, take out Mr. Buttons, wish him good night, tuck him in, and close the box. The kissing was the hardest part, and the smell, but I held my nose and I kept a tissue to wipe my lips. When it kept working, I kept doing it. I've done it every night since Jacob's death. On Christmas Eve, after nights out with friends, my wedding night, I still do it to this very day. Jacob's birthday is always the hardest, but I don't even need to force myself to do it anymore. In fact, I think it will feel strange to stop. I never told anyone about this, because even as a child, I knew nobody would believe me. But now my husband has found the box. We want children soon. What if they find it one day? It's too horrible to even think about. I've been trying to decide what to do all day, but my mind is finally made up. Jacob and Mama hurt the doll, but they didn't destroy it. It only took revenge after they'd done something to it. But if I destroy it, completely and utterly remove it from this world, it wouldn't be able to take its retribution against me. That's my plan anyway. If it doesn't know what I'm planning, it won't be able to get revenge. But I don't know how any of this works. I never have. I have to try. For my husband, for my future children. Tonight, I'm going to kiss the doll goodnight, as I always do. I'm going to tuck him in and close the box. I'm going to wait for my husband to fall asleep and creep downstairs. And then I'm going to burn that fucking box with the doll inside. I'll wait until it's nothing but ashes, and then I'll pour more petrol on the flames. I'll watch it burn all night. For Jacob. For Mama. I'm going to end this horrible doll once and for all. Good night, Mr. Buttons.